The perspectives expressed in this podcast are those of the host and guests. The views expressed are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the National Institute of Health or the United States government.
Hey, Sickle family. I'm Wumi Bakare.
And I'm Dima Hendricks. And we would like to welcome you to the Through the Genes podcast,
where we talk about living, healing, recovering, and exploring curative therapies for sickle cell disease.
We will also talk about our individual curative therapy journeys and the bond that we built as sickle cell sisters.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Through the Genes. I am Wumi Bakare, and I am Dima Hendricks. And today we have a very special guest. We are incredibly honored that she's giving us her time today. But not only that, we were guests on her podcast, and this collaboration just brings my heart and soul so much joy. So I would like to introduce today Kira Dineen. She is a genetic counselor, but first and foremost, she is the host and executive producer of DNA Today. And if you're a science buff or a genetic buff, she has won awards like 3 years in a row. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed that 2024, she's gonna bag that win again. But Kira, can you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, well, you just did a wonderful introduction. Thanks so much, Mumi. So I am a genetic counselor. I work mostly in the pregnancy space. And so that's like that hat that I have. And then, as you mentioned, I've been producing and hosting DNA Today for 12 years now. So this month is our birthday month, September. So it's just been really fun. And I loved that you guys were able to come on the show and that I could ask you so many questions. So it's interesting now when we flip the mic, so to speak.
I like this. Well, happy birthday. Happy early birthday to DNA Today. I mean, 13, you will be 14, 13 or 14?
12, right? Because we started 2012, it's 2024. Yes, if I'm doing my math right, I think it's 12. Yeah.
12 years in the game. And how many seasons? I want to say...
We just keep it rolling. I know.
Okay.
So we do an episode every Friday for the last, 4 or 5 years, something like that. So yeah.
All right. So she's churning out these babies, and this should be a walk in the park for her.
Let's hope. We're setting the bar high for me. Let's see how I deliver.
So I wanted to start by asking, who is Kira? And then what led to your passion for genetics?
So when I started learning about genetics and, I went to Connecticut public schools, so around 7th grade, I think was our first introduction to genetics. I just found it so fascinating in that sometimes I would ask questions, totally being one of the most nerdy people in the room. And oftentimes they'd be like, oh, we actually don't know yet. Like we haven't figured that aspect out of genetics. And I thought that was really cool because in a lot of other areas where we would ask questions, we're like, oh, well, here's the answer. This is how it works. But I found it so invigorating that it's like, oh, we still have to figure this out. And I'm like, wow, in my lifetime, we'll probably have an answer to that. And as scientists work on all this. So I thought it was just so interesting from that perspective of just learning and constantly researching genetics. As you guys have experienced just in the sickle cell community, it changes so fast that something that we don't understand one day, now we have a publication the next. And I think especially CRISPR has been very interesting to me. So, we mentioned that DNA Today started in 2012. There was a huge landmark CRISPR paper published in 2012. And so in the last 12 years, it's been very interesting for me to follow how that has, evolved and how much we've learned. And then especially having the FDA approved treatment in the last year for sickle cell has been such a milestone in sickle cell, but really generically like in healthcare science genetics, because this is huge to go from learning that CRISPR is something that we found basically being bacteria's immune system to now capturing that process, turning it into a technology to then help people and alleviate some of their symptoms. and just all the other things CRISPR can do, will do. So I think that's an aspect that once I started learning about that, 2012, I was a senior in high school. So being 18, learning about this, and then, now being one of my 29, that it's just been such an interesting career and that's just one example, right? Genetics is so interesting in so many different ways. But I think that's one that's always captured my attention.
So you are a genetic nerd.
Oh,
and
yeah. Yeah. I think I've earned that title, right?
and you are also an award-winning podcaster of The Great DNA Today. I want to know when did you realize that you can combine the two? When you can have digital media and genetic counseling. How are you able to marry the two?
Yeah. So, I mean, digital media for me came first. So I started in the podcasting space as a junior in high school, kind of figured it out with another nerdy show about the Hunger Games. There was too many Harry Potter podcasts. So I was like, okay, gotta pivot, do something else in my interest areas. The Hunger Games franchise just been announced in terms of like Jennifer Lawrence was cast as the leading actress, and so I was like, okay, this is going to build up. So I kind of figured out podcasting through that. So after a year in, I was like, well, I want to do something career wise, and I figured scientists and other healthcare providers are not going to take an informational interview with a high schooler. But if I say I'm interviewing you for a show, they're much more likely to take that. So honestly, it was very selfish reasons from the beginning of just trying to network and learn about different careers in genetics. I had heard about genetic counseling and I'm like, all right, well, let me explore this, but also explore other different paths. And so, um, it's been cool to do the show really throughout my career. Now I have a master's. I'm working as a genetic counselor, seeing patients the last 4 years. So it's been interesting to kind of have the show grow with me in that sense of very much learning from the people I'm interviewing to now sometimes, not always, I know just about as much as them, depending on the interviewed, certainly, and in what area it's in. If it's in prenatal, good chance that maybe I'm on the same level as them. But I think as the years have gone on, I've really figured and have seen the impact that especially podcasting can make, and that you guys have experienced too. Of podcasting is so unique in many ways that when you're doing chores, whatever, like you can be listening to something. Obviously, video podcasting has really taken off the last, I would say, 3-4 years. But audio podcasting has this very unique aspect where you could be commuting and you're taking in this information while you're getting something done. And it's just such a great way for people to learn, especially through fantastic interviews like you guys do, to get to know people. The storytelling element is so powerful that you can be hearing someone's story, but they're sprinkling in educational information throughout that. So I just found it to be such a great way, and that podcasting is also so accessible. And so I think there's just a lot of different ways that it was such a good mix of how I want to educate people about genetics. What's the best way to do that? And also that getting into podcasting, you don't have to have as much, like if you're filming a documentary, a movie, you got to have so much equipment, you got to have so much money. I started out with the microphone that came with Rock Band, if you guys remember that.
Oh,
10-15 years ago, Garage Hero, at Garage Hero, Guitar Hero. So, and I took the Harry Potter series, was a perfect mic stand, and put the mic on top of that, and boom, we've got the equipment for a podcast. So I think, in that sense, it was just an easy way to get into it too. So it all kind of culminated together to be able to, keep it going. Obviously now I've updated my setup a little bit, so I'm no longer using that Rock Band mic, but I still have it.
Well, I wanted to ask this question, but I'm asking this question for the community, which is what genetic tests would you recommend to a family? Say, for example, if they just told a newlywed couple that, the child you are expecting is going to have sickle cell disease, what genetic test would you recommend to that family to help them better prepare for their child?
Yeah. So, I mean, if we take it back even further, maybe of when I'm meeting with people that sometimes I meet them preconception, that's like the dream. Most of the time, people are pregnant when I'm meeting with them because that's how our healthcare system works. But if you're listening to this, please, before you try to conceive, I mean, half of pregnancies are not planned. But if you're like, oh, I'm going to try to conceive, meet with a genetic counselor. But doing that during pregnancy or prior to pregnancy, we can do something called carrier screening that I know you both know of very well. But what carrier screening essentially does is it's looking to see if you're what we call a carrier for a condition, including sickle cell. And pretty much all standard carrier screening includes sickle cell. So there are a lot of different levels of carrier screening. Some people will order like 20 conditions, some people order 200 conditions, 700 conditions. There's a lot of differences there. But by the time you get to like 20 conditions, I would pretty much bet on sickle cell being included in that list because it is relatively common, at least in my genetic world, it's common. And so being able to do that and see, okay, if someone is a carrier for sickle cell, then the next step, if it hasn't already been done, is testing their partner or the other biological parent, if it's a sperm or egg donor situation, different types of ways to be a parent, and seeing, okay, are they also a carrier? Chances are they probably are not. Most people that are identified as carrier, most people are. I'm a carrier for a condition. Most of the time, we're not matching with our partner for that condition, but sometimes we are. And that's why we're doing the testing. So in that situation, Mumi, that you're mentioning of, okay, you've been identified, like the pregnant person is identified as a carrier and the biological father, sperm donor, their partner is also a carrier. At that point, then we're like, okay, we know that there's a 25% chance or 1 in 4 chance of the current pregnancy to have sickle cell in any future pregnancies that that couple has together. So I think that's a lot of information that I'm providing patients in that situation. And another kind of, aspect that you're talking about is if there is this chance, we've identified that 25% chance, then a test I talk about at that point is something called an amniocentesis. So that's a procedure where we take a very thin needle to go through, usually through the stomach. Sometimes we can go in vaginally, but oftentimes it's through the stomach. And we capture a little bit of the fluid that the fetus is in. So that's called the amniotic fluid. And as we're all sitting doing this interview, and I'm sitting at a desk, I think you both are as well, we're shedding skin cells and they're falling on our desk. And so fetuses do the same thing in utero. So there are skin cells that are floating in the fluid. There's also their GI cells because fetuses are peeing and drinking the same fluid over and over and over. So you got their GI cells. So you got a lot of cells from baby or fetus that we can capture without actually touching the fetus. We can just capture that in the fluid that they're really suspended in. And from that, we can then test for lots of different genetic conditions. But as we've been talking about, we could test for sickle cell to say, okay, we know that this couple is a carrier. So there is that 25% chance. And some couples, when I'm talking to them about this, I say, this is available. Is this something that you'd be interested in? Do you want to know this information? Do you want to either rule out the diagnosis or, yes, we have confirmed there's sickle cell there? So that is a long-winded way of, summarizing what I end up talking with a lot of patients of starting from that carrier screening to if we're identifying people that are a carrier of the same condition like sickle cell, okay, here's a potential next step. But everything is, here are your options. My job is to give you the options, educate you so that you as the patient understand what those options are, how it could potentially be helpful. And it's not up to me. I don't care what decision patients make. I just want to make sure that they're making the best decision for like them and their family.
Follow-up question to that really quickly. Can you, what other kind of diseases can you detect from the amniotic fluid? Is autism one of them? Because I've also wondered, I have a lot of warrior friends who have children that have autism, and I wonder if that is either linked to sickle cell disease or passed down genetically. I really don't understand autism as broadly as I would like, but is that a test that could be done as well?
That is a great question and probably the most common question I get from all my patients. That what about autism? How is the testing around that? How does it work? And I would also like to know better of how it works. And us in the scientific community would like to know better. There's a lot of things that we still don't understand about autism. There are certain genetic conditions where autism can be a symptom within that condition. So if there is an overarching condition, like a genetic condition, then we could potentially identify that. but most cases of autism are, I would describe them as like isolated, where there's not an overarching condition where autism is a symptom under that. So we still have a lot to learn. Autism is very complex. So it's very limited. I haven't come across anything that links sickle cell and autism specifically. However, I have not read everything out there, right? As much as I go on PubMed and read different articles, I do not have the entire encyclopedia in my head. But I think if there was something that was a very strong correlation and that there was a lot of studies around that, a lot of support around that, I probably would have heard about that. And you guys probably would have heard of it even more than me, right? Just being in the community. But yeah, there's a lot we need to learn about autism, and even after a baby's born and they're developing into a toddler, a child, there even is a certain point where it's like, well, it's too early to diagnose autism. So there's so much that goes into that, but it is something that is pretty common. I don't want to quote because the statistics are constantly changing in terms of how common autism is. But it is quite common. So I think that's something that I'm intrigued to see how much we learn in terms of what are different genetic factors and different roles that genetics plays in autism, as well as other factors too, because it's got to be some kind of a mix, and that everybody's a little bit different, just like with sickle cell.
Mm. Okay, I wanted to go back to a previous episode that you did and on DNA Today. There was a two-part series of you interviewing CRISPR recipient Victoria Gray. I just wanted to know, one, what was your reaction? Did anything surprise you during that interview? Did you have any like reactions to what she was saying? I just wanted to know what was going on in your head during that interview.
Oh, so much, Dima. So, I mean, I am a white person, so that is important to mention, I think, just in terms of this conversation. And I don't have sickle cell. I don't have a genetic condition. And knowing that about me, hearing her experiences prior to receiving the CRISPR treatment, I have talked and I know people who have sickle cell, and I've had conversations about how it's affected them. But to sit down with someone and talk about the medical racism that specifically Victoria has faced, and then just imagine this is her experience. What about all of the people that have sickle cell, and just her experience times however many people have sickle cell in the world and have experienced different levels of medical racism was just, it's one thing to be aware of something, see statistics, see different things, presentations, but to be talking to someone and having them recount, I don't even have a word for how horrendous some of her experiences were. And I'm sure you both, unfortunately, probably have many stories yourselves and that you have shared on the show here, that it just was astounding. And even when I was talking with Victoria Gray, as we did, we kind of chatted before doing our recording just to get to know each other a little bit better. And I asked Victoria because she's done a lot of interviews. She's been on Good Morning America, I believe NPR, a lot of huge, way bigger than DNA Today, and very like mainstream media. And a lot of those interviews are like 10 minutes, right? They're quick. They're not like a podcast where you can really dive into topics. And so I said to her, I was like, obviously I want to talk about your experience with CRISPR, like how that's been like post, I think it's been about 5 years. So Wumi, kind of similar to your timeline in terms of treatment, although yours was different. And I was like, what do you want to talk about that, you haven't been able to? And she was like, the medical racism, like, would I be allowed to talk about that? And I'm like, of course, like, and I was surprised how she phrased that of would I be allowed to talk about that? I'm like, why wouldn't you? And some media platforms and different avenues, outlets have said, oh, we're not going to talk about that. And so that even wasn't part of the interview, right? That was us chatting ahead of time and making a plan for what we want to talk about. And I was like, well, then we're going to dedicate half the interview to this because that is just so, so important. And it's not getting the attention that I see other aspects of sickle cell getting. And one aspect within that when we did our interview on DNA Today, I think it was you that mentioned, just a huge aspect with sickle cell symptoms is the pain crises, and having to then use different pain management, right? So opiates, like different things there. And that something that I was aware of, but then a whole different level of hearing it from Victoria Gray, that just being labeled as a drug seeker and how much of a problem that is with people that have sickle cell. And how have we not kind of, I don't know about if figured that out is the right phrase, but you have intense pain crises. Of course you're going to need pain management. To me, if I was that kind of healthcare provider where I'm a nurse or a doctor or something, or administrating drugs, as soon as I see that there's a diagnosis of sickle cell, I'm like, oh, well, they're not a drug seeker. This is the explanation. And I don't understand where the disconnect is. It's well known that pain crises happen, and that's often what leads people to the hospital and the ER and suddenly having to go somewhere. I don't understand where the disconnect is within healthcare providers once we see that that is a diagnosis. So that is a very long-winded way of just, saying the medical racism, and specifically under that, labeling people and questioning if they're drug seekers after there's a diagnosis in their chart. I don't really understand it.
I wish I had the words to articulate why I think that happens, but in all sincerity, I just think it's implicit bias. I think in the same way when a Black person walks into an elevator and everybody clutches their purses a little tighter, I think it's one of those that we've been conditioned, whether it's through advertising, whether it's through mainstream media, to see Black people as either combative or aggressive or suspicious. And so I think a wave of those labels and assumptions has trickled even into the medical system. And I remember interviewing Dr. Amal Saidi, who is another podcaster. He's a pediatric hematologist. And he said, I'm of Indian descent and I took the test and I was biased. I did it the first time and I was like, no, maybe something was going on with me that day when I took it. Let me take it on another day. And he said he took it twice. And it said, and based off of his answer, he does favor, like once a white person walks in the way in which he listens, it does, and it was one of those things where he had to check himself after those tests, because the realization of like, wait, what? It's something like an aha mirror moment of realizing that, like, oh my God, I also have a way of viewing people of color that isn't right, and I need to fix that for myself before I can even lend myself to truly advocating and helping my patients. And so I think there isn't one short answer. I just think over time different things have impacted that. But I kind of wanted to segue a little bit to support and resources. Many of us, I'm glad that I've been introduced to you. I think the only other genetic counselor I know works for a company called Beam Therapeutics. But what kind of support and resources can a genetic counselor offer, one, patients living with sickle cell disease, or soon to be parents or couples who are maybe looking to get married? Like, I know for us sickle cell warriors, because we do have the SS genotype, we really need to be conscious of who we choose to partner with, marry, have children with, procreate with, because we could pass on our illness to our offspring. So what kind of support services do genetic counselors offer that we as individuals living with this disease or impacted by this disease need to be aware of and leverage that professional insight before, as we navigate our life?
Yeah, certainly. So, you're talking about really two groups of people that have sickle cell and are looking for further information for themselves, and then people that are either carriers of sickle cell or have it themselves, but are looking at, figuring out their path to parenthood. So talking about that second area of, pursuing parenthood, I think it's very helpful, as I mentioned, to do carrier screening. So if someone has sickle cell, as you mentioned, that means that they are only passing down a copy of the gene that has what we call a pathogenic variant or a mutation. So in order for offspring of someone that has sickle cell to not have it themselves and have a chance for that, it would mean having a partner that is either does not have sickle cell, or is a carrier of sickle cell, because then you have a chance, or just completely is not a carrier and doesn't have sickle cell. So if you have two people that are carriers, or, in the community more referred to as having trait, then there is that 25% chance. And if you learn about that chance, if you're in that situation, you and your partner are both carriers, you don't have the full condition, but you're carriers, you have trait, then there's different options. So some people, finances, unfortunately, are a big obstacle and can be to this, but there are some people that learn of their carrier status and say, well, instead of conceiving naturally and taking a chance, we want to pursue in vitro fertilization, IVF. And through the IVF process, they can also include something called pre-implantation genetic testing or screening, PGT, PGS, a lot of acronyms flying around, right? But basically what it is, for people watching the video, actually, this is kind of what's happening in this poster behind me, where this is an embryo. We're able to basically take out one cell or a few cells and then test that and see, okay, this embryo, what is the diagnosis? Is there two quote unquote broken copies of the gene that have mutations? Where, okay, if that embryo develops into a human, that human would have sickle cell. Or is this embryo going to be a carrier where they have one working copy, which mostly makes them healthy? Carriers can have some symptoms, as we've talked about, but overall healthy, doesn't have a full diagnosis of sickle cell. Or they didn't inherit any of the quote unquote broken genes, and they are completely, I guess, sickle cell free. So both of their copies of the gene related to sickle cell works properly. So their red blood cells are going to be that healthy donut shaped. It's going to be flexible. It's going to move well within, our bloodstream and not lead to those pain crises caused by the blood cells in the sickle shape being, all condensed and kind of stuck in a spot. So doing that, then hopefully you got a lot of embryos, you test each of them, and hopefully some of them don't have any of the mutation, and people can then pursue to implant those and have a baby that is not a carrier and will not have sickle cell. Sometimes though, you'll have embryos and some are carriers and some have the condition and none of them are necessarily free. So it depends what you do. And that's why sometimes people go through multiple rounds of egg retrieval and testing embryos. It is not a easy, oh, we'll just do IVF. Like, it is very involved. I have personally not gone through IVF or egg retrieval. Could be in my future. Just being queer, that's why. But that is an option. But again, finances, if insurance isn't covering it, if your employer doesn't include that in some of their, benefits. So there's a lot of things there. And so there's other options. Let's say maybe using an egg or sperm donor so that you're not having a full biological child with your partner. But, well, if that is maybe a cheaper alternative financially, or you just have this person in your life that you want to be a donor, there's so many different things. Adoption. I mean, there's so many different other pathways. But for those that do conceive naturally, we talked about the testing during pregnancy, like the amniocentesis. So there are so many different options, and obviously we can't cover them all in the interview. But that's why it's so important to meet with a healthcare provider that is well versed in genetics, like a genetic counselor, so that you can talk about all these options and what makes sense for you. So that's the answer for what about pursuing parenthood. Now, for people that have sickle cell, depending on what age you are, if it's a kiddo, then going to see a pediatric geneticist and genetic counselor usually are a great team, and being able to explore and learn about all the different treatments available. That when we were on DNA Today and I was interviewing both of you, we talked about there are so many options, and being able to figure out, again, the personalization aspect, what makes sense for this person, how old they are, how many pain crises are they having, how many times are they going to the hospital, how is it really affecting their life, what level is it? And that is going to give you information in terms of what level risk do we want to take in terms of doing a bone marrow transplant, doing the CRISPR therapy, all of these different options, different like pharmaceutical, like medications. And also just being able to connect you with other people, right? You both are involved and connected with organizations. And that is huge. So as a genetic counselor, when I come across a condition and I can educate them, hey, here's what I know about the condition, like here's your textbook answers. That's helpful, right? You got to have some of that. But what's even better, talking with someone that has the condition or a parent or a caregiver of someone that has the condition. That's way better, right? So if I in the future am talking to a couple and they learn we have diagnosed, their fetus with sickle cell, I'm going to say, if you want, I can introduce you to someone that has sickle cell to really answer better that personal experience. And I'm going to reach out to you guys and say, hey, any chance you guys have a half hour, an hour to talk to this parent on the phone, right? That the networking aspect of figuring that out is really helpful. I think in a lot of ways, depending on the situations, that can often be more impactful and helpful than talking to me as a genetic counselor, depending on what spot they're at, right? But if we already have a diagnosis, you guys are going to be able to tell them so much more about sickle cell and living with it than I am, right? Once they're at that point, you guys are going to be way more helpful to them than I will.
This is such a rich episode of
It's information heavy, isn't it?
it's very information heavy. In fact, I was going to mention I've learned so much in this time of being a podcaster of Through the Genes, and um co-hosting is an honor and privilege because of this learning experience. And thus far, I've learned a lot about genetic counseling. And each time I interview a sickle cell warrior or a doctor, I learn so much. Even though I have sickle cell disease, there's so much that I'm learning each time. So my question to you is, what have you learned by interviewing people that are affected by sickle cell disease?
Oh my gosh. I mean, so much, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, just interviewing both of you, even of just learning how long of a journey it is to get to a point of kind of hopefully having more stability in terms of health, and that it's not, oh, you have a diagnosis, you go in, you get your treatment, you just keep it going. That even after treatment, even after stem cell therapy, like Wumi experienced with her brother being a donor, you're still having things. So I think that there's just so much to learn that, yeah, it's kind of almost hard to answer, right? There's just so many aspects of it, but knowing that it's continuous, unfortunately, right? That things can take a turn. And some people, like we mentioned, Victoria Gray has experienced that she hasn't had any symptoms after recovering from her CRISPR treatment, but that's not everybody's experience. And I think that is a big thing that I learned after meeting you guys and, starting our friendship and figuring out, like, there's just so many nuances to this to learn, and that there's not a clear roadmap in terms of, oh, you get a diagnosis. Okay, so you see your pediatric hematologist, and then you go and do this. And then once you're at this age, you do that. Like, it's just so different. And that even within the US, healthcare is so different in different states. I'm New York based. So, New York, Connecticut. So Boston's right there. So I'm very familiar, out here, but it's just even within the US is so different. And then you open that up to globally and it's just so different. So we've made a lot of progress, I think, and I never want to undermine that. There's been major milestones in genetics and specifically in sickle cell, but we also have a long way to go, right? So it's both. It's the dialectic there.
I like that you shared that we have only scratched the surface, even though we are in a better position than we were, give or take 30, 40 years ago. When we interviewed Mr. Bonham, one of the things he mentioned is that, 1918, sickle cell was diagnosed. There was not a standard of care treatment until 98. And I said to myself, what happened to all of the people living with sickle cell disease within that almost like 70-year gap, 80-year gap? Like, what happened to them? How did they get to live their life? Because we as warriors are still trying to understand how our disease manifests, that I can only imagine they were completely in the dark on how overwhelming that must have felt. But thank you for coming on. I think as we were having this conversation, I just had like this aha moment where I said, we really need to connect you to Tiana Wolford, because I
Yes.
think one of the conversations in this space that we are not having is the importance of genetic counseling for warriors and for people that have sickle cell trait. I think learning from you today has really opened my mind. And as someone that has been through IVF myself, because I had to cryopreserve my eggs, again, because I was going to go through conditioning regimen, which is chemotherapy and radiation prior to transplantation. There are different things that I don't know what that journey is going to look like, but I know it's not going to be a linear road. It's going to have bumps in different places, because I now have to figure out, how is conceiving a child going to happen for me? Am I okay to carry? And if I can't carry, then what happens? Do I need to explore the option of adoption or surrogacy? There are just so many things to unpack. And I think in this space, one conversation that is missing is that genetic counseling aspect. And so I'm hopeful that after this conversation, maybe we can find a way to start these types of conversations if you're open.
Oh, very much so.
Yeah, I think this doesn't end with just Dima and I. This needs to be a conversation that we're having as community, where other warriors can chime in and say, well, then here's a little bit of my story. Because one thing I've been reading more recently is that so many doctors are telling sickle cell patients, you have no business having children.
Oh, I hate hearing that. That's terrible.
What
an overarching statement. Like, that's not, and there's so many pathways to parenthood, right? Yeah, that's atrocious.
So to hear that, and then to know people personally who have lived through that, of a doctor saying, like, don't do it. It's there's so many facets to sickle cell disease, and so many times as warriors that we're told, you won't live till this age. You cannot have children that are meant to break us. But I feel like the more educated you are, the more empowered you are. And I think this type of information needs to exist not only on this podcast, but in rooms where warriors are starting to. I would have needed a conversation like this when I was a teenager.
Yeah. And just, I'm sure so many people listening, yeah, especially like teenagers, that look to you both as role models of, you've been through so much, and to be here and be as articulate as you are, and just honoring what you've been through, but also having the positive side and the humor that you bring to things is so important and needed. Like, we all need comic relief when we're going through hard aspects of our life. There's a reason that term has been coined, right? And I think it is very important. And, hopefully myself and other genetic counselors can be a part of bridging gaps that exist in education around this, and figuring out resources. And again, like, that networking aspect is just so important. And no, I just want to thank you both so much for being able to, like, inviting me on and being able to share a little bit with your audience.
So I want to thank you for being a part of the Through the Genes podcast experience with myself and my co-host, my sickle sister Wumi. Was there anything else that you wanted to share with our audience today before you leave?
I think, just to almost recap, it's so important to be your own advocate. I see this so much. I mean, we've hit 300 episodes of DNA today, and we have bonus lessons on top of that. And one thing that I've learned from interviewing countless advocates in the rare disease space, and other genetic conditions and hereditary cancer, so much, right? As well as other more traditional experts. But I see patient advocates as being experts in their own right, that it is so important to educate yourself. So the fact that you got to the end of this interview, amazing. You are educating yourself, listeners and viewers, and learning about organizations and reaching out to them, and volunteering your time if you can, and just being able to expose yourself to as much as you can, so that you are educated and understanding your options. And if you are sensing a roadblock from healthcare providers and they're saying something that seems to be like a very conversation ending statement, like, well, people with sickle cell shouldn't have children, something that is just, oh my gosh, then question it. It's so important to question it. And I really encourage, even when I meet with patients, when they ask questions and this and that, and they're really engaged, and that they're pushing it a little bit, right? When they're saying, okay, well, you said this, but why is that? And this and that. And I so encourage that. Do I always have the answers? Definitely not. But I am very quick to say, I don't know that, but let me do as much research as I can and get back to you with what I find. And I think just being an advocate and educating yourself is just so, so important. And you're already doing it. So more of a, congrats on, being able to educate yourselves in these different ways.
Wumi, any final thoughts before we take off?
This was amazing. Again, my wheels are turning. Kira, please don't be a stranger. Again, leverage us in whatever capacity you need, but I will also like to leverage you as well. And so offline, I want to see what we can arrange or figure out so that this conversation can be brought to life on a stage where I know other warriors like myself, both male and female, need to be aware of this so that the earlier the better. The more we educate ourselves, the more we know how to navigate different spaces. And so I'm really excited as to what the future holds in terms of like collaborating with you on other things as well.
Oh, it's just the start. I've got lots of guest recommendations for you guys, but I'll tell you offline. That way, we're not teasing the audience too much.
This has been an awesome conversation. We want to thank Kira Dineen of the award-winning podcast DNA Today. And on behalf of myself, Dima Hendricks, and my wonderful Wumi Bakare, my sickle sister, thank you for joining us. For more information about Through the Genes and throughthepain.org, please visit us at throughthepain.org.
Through the Genes is funded by the National Human Genome Research Institute, part of the National Institutes of Health, through the Democratizing Education for Sickle Cell Disease Gene Therapy Project. Don't forget to follow Sickle Cell Prodigy and Through the Pain, Inc. for additional resources and initiative updates. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Through the Genes.